Hey everyone, Adam here. In today's video, we're going to look at the audio I/O of the whole studio and how I make it work and why I did it the way I did. Basically, whenever I designed the studio when we were building it, I had a couple goals in mind, so I'm going to show you those and how we go about doing it. Let's go. Okay, so I think the most logical place to start will be here at the desk. So on the desk, I built the desktop, bought the legs, like height adjustable legs and all that. And each of these three bays has 5 rack spaces, and it's all built around me being able to go in Ableton Live, which is my DAW of choice, and basically double click a preset for an external instrument, and I can play all these synths on both sides of me just by clicking on it. The MIDI side of it I covered in another video, so you can find that if you're interested. So, for example, I can do something like this. So as long as the synth is on, so I'll pick one that's on, I'll double click my preset called Rev2, playing my controller here on the desk, and it's playing. And likewise, something on the opposite side of the room, Op6 is on. Listen to that lovely FM bass. So I can do that with pretty much all the keyboards, all the rack modules, most all the stuff over here is set up that way. So what that means is I need tons of inputs into the computer. So the way I achieved that is I'm using the Presonus Quantum 4848 interface. They actually don't make these anymore. They're Thunderbolt 2. So I basically chain them together with Thunderbolt 2 cables and then goes into the Thunderbolt 3 to 2 adapter into my Mac Mini. I'm using one of the newer M2 Mac Minis. It still works great with it. I really wish they'd make a newer version because I'm worried that someday it's going to stop working. Anywho, so the way these interfaces work are, as the name implies, there's 48 inputs, 48 outputs on each. The first 32 are analog on 4 pairs of DB25 cables, 8 channels apiece. The last 16 inputs and outputs are digital. They are on ADAT, optical inputs and outputs. It's also got a word clock I/O. I am using a sync box. Let me push my monitor out of the way. This Blackline audio sync box. So it saves everything at 48K. The only other audio interface I have in the room currently is over here in the modular area. I've got the Expert Sleepers ES8. It can actually sync to external clock as well through its ADAT input. The sync box does not have ADAT compatible optical outputs, so I'm actually taking one of the ADAT outputs of these into the ES8 just to give it sync signal, so if I use the ES8, it can stay in sync digitally with everything else. Okay, so that's how it connects to the computer. So how do I get all these outboard processors and synths into it? Well, there's a spreadsheet involved, so I'm going to put it in front of me as a cheat sheet. I'm definitely not using even close to all the outputs of the interface, but I am using most of the inputs. So Quantum 1, the bottom one, it connects all the stuff on the desk basically first through the analog I/O. So it also, these do not have like traditional 1/4 inch or XLR main outputs. So I had to get something to the monitor controller so I can monitor, so I can hear things. So the first set of analog I/O actually goes in and out of this to this patch bay. And hooked to this patch bay is the 2 inputs of the monitor controller, so I can switch between 2 different things. I can use it for effects on the desk, like the CXM 1978 pretty much stays here all the time. And various other effects I can just set here and plug in. So that's what the patch bay is for pretty much. Like, it just gives me that first analog 8 in and 8 out available to use. So the other 3 DB25s on Quantum 1 here are the I/O of my 3 500 series racks. Each of these are 8 channels. They all have DB25. So it's an easy hookup with just a fairly short DB25 cable. There's a couple tricks. If you own one of these, AMS Neve, what's it called? RMX16. The inputs and outputs are kind of funky, so I had to do a couple tricks to make it work. Anyway, that doesn't really matter. So basically, these are all set up as effects plugins in Ableton Live as external audio effects. So I can easily, just like the synths, double click on them and get them whatever I have playing routed through it. So I still have our lovely FM bass here. So for example, I can go up here and say I want to put the RMX16 on it for whatever reason. I'll double click that, and it's on 100% wet, so it sounds crazy. But it's now routing through this guy. So makes it really easy. And likewise, I've got presets saved for like this, which is typically hooked to the patch bay, so I can easily throw that on there too. My compressors and EQs, mic pre's and all that. These 500 series racks have this lovely TT patch bay. So I actually leave a lot of stuff just pre-patched all the time in the analog domain, because obviously, like if I wanted this to this to this, I wouldn't want to do that in the computer because it's going to create tons of latency to go in and out of the computer, in and out of the computer. Yeah, that doesn't make sense. So in other words, I take out of the big into the ultraviolet, out of the ultraviolet into the G comp, and then that goes back into the computer. So that's how I typically leave this set up. And likewise over here, I've got like a mic pre and compressor, or I mean de-esser, compressor, and EQ that I leave chained together, and then a second de-esser and EQ chained together for another effects send on the computer. And then I've got my two SSL6 single channel deals. I've got presets set up to use in stereo or mono or however I want to do it. So that's cool. So then that's the 32 analog on the first Quantum. Next are the two ADAT ports. Those are actually in use. So like I told you earlier, one of them, the output is actually hooked over to the modular side to the ES8 just for sync purposes, though I could use it for something else if I really wanted to. The ADAT port 1 and 2 inputs are actually connected over here, which we'll move to next. I've got the Ferrofish Pulse 16 over here. And in short, what that is, it gives you 16 analog inputs and outputs on 1/4 inch jacks, and then it converts it to ADAT level. They have fancier ones that do Matty and Dante and all that. This one just does the ADAT stuff. So over here, those inputs are connected to that patch bay, and then all the synths, modular stuff are connected to those inputs through the patch bay. And the reason I use so many patch bays, which I've talked about a lot about patch bays in other videos, is because I want to be able to repatch anything to anywhere, throw effects, like throw a pedal on something in the analog domain. Makes everything super easy. I mean, as you can see, I've got stuff patched right now. So basically, all the outputs from pretty much everything on this side of the room go into the Pulse 16 and over two kind of long ADAT cables runs behind the desk into Quantum 1's ADAT inputs. So that's the first Quantum and how I'm using that. Okay, so now for the second Quantum 4848. Its first two DB25 analog inputs, so 16 channels, comes from this side of the room. I just have two DB25 snakes running from here to there around the back of the room. Again, it hooks to those patch bays, and you've got 16 analog inputs, all these keyboards, and the rack stuff next to it connects to those inputs. And they hook up analog there then to the computer and through the patch bay. The second two DB25 inputs comes from my WMD performance mixer over here in the Eurorack case. This is like my main mixer, and it has this module that'll output all channels plus the master through two DB25 cables. And so I've got those going out again through two pretty long cables over to that top interface. Those don't actually go through a patch bay. So that would be an exception to me not hooking it to the patch bay. But it doesn't really, it's kind of irrelevant to do that because I've got all this stuff I can repatch with. Then, let's see. I think that's everything. I'm not actually using the ADAT ports yet on the second Quantum. So how could I do this differently? Well, this side I could get another Pharaohfish Pulse 16 and eliminate those giant analog snakes between the sides. Definitely something I would consider. Of course, that's expensive, and this way works fine. And because of those extra ADAT inputs, that would make it so I can add a Pulse 16 or something like it to add 16 more inputs if I really wanted to. I'm really happy with the way this works. Like I said, they don't make these anymore. They're kind of hard to find on Reverb. I really wish they would make a new version of it because, correct me if I'm wrong, if you know something I don't, but like I've looked for audio interfaces with that much DB25 connectivity on the back, and they're incredibly expensive. Like anything that is currently made with like 32 channels of analog I/O, really, really expensive. So hopefully someone someday will make another version of this that's like Thunderbolt 3 or something more modern. But in the meantime, it's working great for me. So in review, that makes it so all the inputs and outputs, including all my 500 series stuff on the desk, is all available. I can save them as presets in Ableton Live, double click them, and just use them. Easy peasy. That was my first main goal. So real quick, I touched on the monitoring situation. So those patch bay analog I/O, this is my monitor controller, the Presonus Central Station. It has two pairs of stereo inputs, so you can switch between two sources. They're both connected to the patch bay. Outputs 1, 2 of the very first interface, so the default output of the computer goes into input 1, and then this is hooked to my Atom Audio monitors, and then I've got the second set of speakers hooked to my other older monitors, and it's got a third output which I've hooked to the subwoofer so I can turn it on or off depending on if I want to use it. So on to the second goal. Okay, so for this part, I'm just going to walk around with the camera. So sorry about the audio quality change of my voice. The second reason I did the audio stuff the way I did is for flexibility. As you can see, there's tons of stuff. So a lot of the times, as most people say, when inspiration strikes, you don't want to jack around with all the technicalities of things. So oftentimes I will use like an external sequencer or the modular synth or something like that, or my Ableton Push 3, which I've got set up here on my table, to just jam, come up with song ideas. Maybe friends are over and you just want to play around on the guitars or basses or drums from the modular. So in order for that to happen, you would have to have the computer on, something open like Ableton to monitor the inputs, because these interfaces do not have like an analog monitoring situation you can set up on like their software. Unfortunately, I know a lot of newer stuff has that. So what I did to make that happen is first run everything through patchbays, which you've seen and I've talked about 100 times before. That makes it so I can pull any input or output from anywhere and repatch it. It also allows me to use the pedals. I'm going to flip the camera around and show you what else I got. So over here in pedal area, you know, a lot of the stereo stuff is going through its own patch bay just for ease of use. Otherwise, these ones are for all the synths going to the computer, mostly. Just the first 16 go to the computer, and then these are just extra stuff that I don't use as often. More pedals down here. So, like, say I want to hang out and jam with a guitarist or bassist, or I'm laying down a bass track or coming up with an idea, I can easily grab the bass. I can plug it in to like my bass pedal board over here, But then comes the issue of how do I get the sound out of the speakers? So that's where this mixer comes into play. It's an older Firewire Presonus mixer we used to use for our interface. We still use it when we play live, but it's just hooked up basically with all 16 of its analog inputs. I've got hooked to this patch bay down here. And so in order to hear stuff, the output of this has an analog pair going over to the patch bay, goes into the second input by default on the monitor controller, and then with a push of a button, instead of listening to the output of the computer, I'm listening to the output of this mixer. So that makes that flexibility of being able to just play the instruments. I don't even have to have the computer on. I don't have to do any of that. And then you've got 16 inputs, the last 4 of which can be stereo pairs, so 8 mono and 4 stereo if I like. That comes into use a lot more often than you might think. So over here I've got this table full of junk, lots of junk, but I'm trying to work on a live set for some of my instrumental music, and so, you know, it's kind of this self-contained thing right now, so I need audio output going to the speaker so I can hear something. So I've got the output of my main mixer here going into the patch bay over there into the mixer just so I can give it some gain and put it through the speakers. And likewise, if I just want to play guitars through my pedals or bass through my pedals, I can just plug it straight into the mixer. I've also got the first few channels, I've got a stereo direct box and a mono direct box going into the back. And then when it comes time, if I want to actually record any of this stuff, it's not a big deal. I can just unpatch it here, patch it into the analog inputs on the desk, or some other combination of stuff. It's very flexible, and that's the other goal of the audio stuff in the studio. Just like the MIDI, like if you've watched that video, the MIDI can all be controlled by this desktop sequencer, the Squark Pyramid, if I really want to, and not even use the computer. In situations like that, I actually do have a template saved in Ableton Live that basically uses it as a recorder of sorts. So it basically takes, it's set up to basically any of the inputs I can arm. It slaves to the pyramid MIDI-wise, and then I can just track record however many channels of synths or whatever I'm doing at the time. So that's also a possibility that I've not used very much, but it is there if I need to. So there you go. I hope you enjoyed my little quick audio tour. If you have any questions, of course, ask, or any suggestions either. I'm open to suggestions. Overall, I love the way it works. It also works well, unlike a lot of things I've used in the past that had finicky pieces of equipment or, you know, interfaces. You know how things are. They just don't connect or something dumb like that. So none of that's happening with this current setup. So I really like that aspect of it. It's pretty much you turn it on and it works, which is a huge, huge thing. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.